Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to Banu Group's webinar. Today's talk is entitled, Can Pharmaceutical Companies Afford Not to Have Adjudication Committees? My name is Marianne Doblé and I will be your host for today. I'll start with some practical information first. Today's webinar will run for about 60 minutes and the two presentations will be followed by a Q&A session with our speakers. To make this webinar work best, your interaction is key. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the question box, and we will try to address your question during the Q&A session. The question box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message in the box. At this stage, all the participants are on a listen-only mode, and please note this event will be recorded and made available for future downloads on Banu Group's website. Few words in introduction about Banu Group. We started as Core Lab in 1999, centralizing cardiac safety data for the pharmaceutical industry. Guaranteeing robustness and quality in data handling, Banu extending its activity to centralized imaging services and MACE adjudication, being so able to conduct multi-services trials worldwide. Today's talk will cover two topics. First, we will discuss why adjudication committees are required in terms of medical and quality assurance, but also in terms of regulatory requirements. After this, during the second talk, we will focus on how adjudication committees are organized in terms of study endpoints, but also in terms of safety assessment. And now I would like to introduce our speakers for this event. Professor Frank Brentano is a board-certified cardiologist and clinical pharmacologist acting as consultant with Banu Group. His expertise in clinical trial is widely recognized in the pharma industry. Chairman or member of Adjudication Critical Events Committees since 1989 in CBIS program, CBIS 1, 2, and 3, Inside and others, he is also involved in safety review, such as MedDRA database cleaning or blinded adjudication of safety endpoints. Our second speaker for today is Professor Hans-Christoph Diener, who is Professor of Neurology and Chairman of the Department of Neurology at the University of Essen in Germany. He is also Chairman of the Essen Stroke Center, the Essen Vertigo and Dizziness Center, and the Intensive Care Unit. As former President of the German Neurological Society, he has extensive experience in clinical trials. And without any further ado, I would like to hand the microphone to our first speaker for today, Professor Christian Frank Brentano. Is it okay now on your side?
No, it's fine.
Okay,
Marvelous.
sorry.
Thank you very much. So hello to everyone. The topic of my talk is why do we need adjudication committees? And the first reason for that, Marion, if I can move the slide forward. Good, thank you. So what is at stake here are two things. The first thing is study endpoints. The main purpose of phase 3 and sometimes phase 2 trials is to collect information that is reliable during intervention trials, at least for drug development. Many of these trials look at endpoints that are too complex to be properly reported by investigators without quality control. And it's surprising that there are many quality controls in drug development, but very few so far regarding the quality of the medical information that constitutes the main study endpoints of all these studies. Also, in many studies, there are several patients may experience multiple events at the same time. And it's important that predefined rules are set up by the adjudication committee together with the sponsor and the steering committee to define which of these multiple events need to be validated for the purpose of the trial. The second topic regards safety endpoints, and that's a rather recent aspect of adjudication committees. Now, you know that the regulatory tool for pharmacovigilance is MEDRA. MEDRA is a very powerful tool, but it's not highly medicalized. It's difficult to detect from MEDRA what is the exact nature of the medical condition that constitutes a safety signal. And some drugs require specific safety endpoints to be prospectively monitored. So that's also an application of an adjudication committee. There are guidances from the FDA and the EMA that address this issue of quality control of source data and medical information. This guidance from the FDA of December 2008 impose that for type 2 diabetes and drugs being developed in diabetes type 2, sponsors should establish an independent cardiovascular endpoint committee to prospectively adjudicate in a blinded way all cardiovascular events in all phase 2 and phase 3 trials. So this is an area of medicine where now there is compelling pressure from the regulatory agency to constitute these endpoint committees. And there are different proposals to detect specific events listed below. There is an older document from the FDA that determines and suggests the establishment of operation and clinical trial data monitoring committees. And this document back in 2006 mentions that sponsors may also choose to establish an endpoint assessment adjudication committee or critical event committee in some trials to review important endpoints that are difficult to qualify and to quantify. And they give as an example laboratory, pathology, imaging data, autopsy reports, physical descriptions, or any other data deemed relevant. In other words, it is not suggesting that all trials should have adjudication committee, but it is suggested that when the data that constitute the study endpoints are too complex to trust investigators just straightforward, such committees may be useful and need to be considered. Typically, these committees are blinded to study drugs assignments, and this is clearly something that is part of the so-called probe study design, the prospective randomized open study and blinded endpoints design. There are also specific guidance documents for some specific topics, and here I have shown one example for people who are developing drugs for the treatment of acute bacterial skin and skin structure infections. So I suggest that if you have any area that you are developing a drug, you look at the FDA and EMA sites, or even look at PubMed and detect whether there are recommendations on how to clearly document and harmonize the way events are being classified in such developments. The EMA also has an old document from 2005, which is a guideline on data monitoring committees, where it specifies that in clinical studies where endpoints are complex to assess or include a subjective component, and that's very often the case when you're looking at clinical events, they are suggesting that an adjudication committee consisting of clinical experts in a specific clinical area might be set up. Not but it's a strong suggestion that it may be useful. And again, these committees by definition are always blinded to treatment assignments. They take as an example the case for the adjudication of radiological events are more complex to assess because more subjective. Finally, more recently, there is a draft document in preparation that also addresses the guidance for safety assessments and recommends that sponsors use a safety assessment committee. So that's the second topic, again, of adjudication committee. It's not only study endpoints, but it's also safety assessment committee And in my opinion, it reflects the fact that FDA at least acknowledges the fact that MedDRA is not designed for medicalized information regarding safety issues. It's a different logic. And so this document is just new, it's out for discussion, and I think it will be important to follow the work of the group of people who are working on it. Now, let's give example of practical example of reclassification of clinical events by an adjudication committee. This is a study that I was involved in as a member of the critical event committee. It was a study in hypertension where we were looking at events. The slide is not very good, but you can look at MI, myocardial infarction here. Above are the primary events that were reported by the investigators. Below are the same events after being reviewed by the critical event committee. And as you can see, you have 554 primary events reported. And this decreases by 21% to a number of 439 primary events that have been validated. Now let's just look at myocardial infarction. The number of deaths attributed to myocardial infarction is 26 by the investigators, and we agreed on all of these. But if you look at the cases reported as non-lethal myocardial infarction, the investigators reported 168, and we only validated 125 of these events. And you can see that this is the same for the different type of events. And that's a very classical phenomenon. Usually, adjudication committee get down to less events than the events reported by the investigators. It's striking for heart failure, which is a difficult diagnosis, sometimes reported in patients who have dyspnea, but do not meet the predefined definitions that adjudication committees make to validate heart failure. So as you can see, 18 deaths of heart failure transforms into only 3 deaths attributed to death failure in this trial. We're not, excuse me, there is another example shown here where in this study in patients with coronary heart disease, the adjudication committee changed 28% of the events reported initially by the investigators. Now, what's interesting in this study is this slide, where dead is dead. Clearly, if you are only looking at total death, you do not need an adjudication committee. It's easy to document. If you're looking at the cause of death, we'll see that it's much more difficult to adjudicate. But let's look at acute myocardial infarction. Reported by the investigators were 106 cases. This study, the committee only validated 84. 12 were not validated because they were part of the index MI, that was the qualifying event to enter the trial, and were not by study design to be reported as an event. 23 cases were either nothing or recurrent angina pectoris. There are many examples of such difficult classifications, and clearly the critical event committee does a good cleaning job on these trials. But you may say, and actually it was once set asked to be, why do you consider that a committee exterior to the investigators would do better than investigators? And this is being addressed in this slide, where the classification of the critical event committee were sent back to the investigators, saying, we disagree with you, would you consider our new adjudication? And when this was done, 77% of the investigators agreed to change their initial classification according to the CEC report. 23 disagreed, and of these, the critical event committee considered that they were right in very few cases. Now, why would a committee be better than the investigator? There are many reasons for that. One of them is that they're working independent based on source documents that are predefined and collect information in a systematic way. There are also problems, and this is a paper that addresses this issue with the type of the detection of safety events, and that's an example for major bleedings, and Hans Christoph has a very extensive experience of that. How do you harmonize the classification of bleedings in anticoagulants and antiplatelet trials? Finally, it's not only cardiovascular that is at stake. This is a paper that shows that the adjudication committee also has a role to clean, in a way, the response rate and progression-free survival in phase 3 oncology clinical trials. This is shown on the next slide, where this is the response rate according to the investigators. And this is the response rates in ordinate according to the committee. The line here represents the line of identity. In other words, if both investigators and the committee would agree, all these data points would be on this line. As you can see, most of these data points are below the identity line, which means that the adjudication committee considered that progression-free survival was less than what the investigators considered. So clearly there is a great need for quality assurance of the medical information in clinical trials. Now, the key question about endpoint is, can you really measure them? And I think this is an old slide, but I like to show it when people trust the classification of cause of death. Let's look only at the left-hand side of the slide, the EMIAT study called amiodarone in patients with arrhythmias. The slide shows a reduction in arrhythmic death quite in a different way, but no significant effect on total death. Now, how is that possible? Now, you reduce arrhythmic death and you do not reduce total death. It means that you need to increase some other cause of death. So in that study, actually, the definition of arrhythmic death is that when they had no information, they were classifying this as arrhythmic death, which in my opinion does not make any sense at all. Now this is an example, unpublished data, initial classification of two survival curves of sudden death. It's actually cumulative death curves of sudden death, and you have two different drugs, and there is a significant effect with a significant reduction with this drug compared to the other one. Now, the same data were reviewed independently by the adjudication committee, and the difference was extremely small. If you look at the numbers below, you have small numbers of patients, not many events. But if you look at the reclassification scheme, the difference is not huge, not many differences, but the difference does not reach significance anymore. So the first slide, we thought we could publish in the Lancet, and in the second slide, we published in another journal, not as great. So small differences can make big differences in outcome. Now, I like this slide. I hope I'm not shocking anyone, but this is a man who makes a poll to an American family, and he is asking them who really killed Jesus. And the options are the Jews, the Romans, Karl Marx, or Santa Claus. And this family definitely considers that Santa Claus is responsible for killing Jesus. That shows that when you make a judgment on something that is not clear-cut, you always have some degree of subjectivity, and that's why you need a group of people to discuss these issues, to focus and reconcile potential conflicts. Now, there is a considerable literature on the subject. I have at the top of this slide indicated PubMed keywords that you will find here. If you match these keywords with your specific topic, you will, I'm sure, find recommendations and good guidelines. Two articles here, recent articles, make recommendations of working groups on how to document data. Surprisingly, these very interesting articles do not at all define the internal rules that adjudication committee may follow, and that's clearly something that is part of the initial work before you set up an adjudication committee, before you start the study, is how do you handle the different events. So just read these articles, you'll be interested. So finally, well, one of the questions is, why don't we just simply use the pharmacovigilance data that is systematically part of any clinical trial follow-up? And the answer that I have to this is that pharmacovigilance is different from randomized clinical trials. The logic of clinical trials is to target events which constitute primary and secondary endpoints of the trial, and also, for some trials, look at specific safety targets in addition to MedDRA and need to detect prospectively events, and that's the case. Most often we're actually involved in a program where the FDA asks for specific cardiovascular follow-up in a development program with a drug that has nothing to do with cardiology. And the idea here is to guarantee that these events are properly detected, validated, and classified. And for that, you need an adjudication committee. So you don't need an adjudication committee in all trials, but anytime you have events that may vary according to investigators that are difficult to classify, you do need an adjudication committee. The logic of pharmacovigilance is very different. Pharmacovigilance makes no comments on adverse events reported. Any adverse event, whether severe or non-severe, is going to be part of the database. And very often, the poor pharmacovigilance people are running after the information to try to get medical information and get proper information and good quality reports. So I'm not saying that pharmacovigilance is not needed. It's extremely important. I'm saying that it's not the format that addresses the issue of the quality of information in clinical trials. So my concluding slide is, if I can move it forward, yes, is garbage in, garbage out. If you collect information in clinical trials that is noisy, you will get a trial that is noisy and possibly actually a trial that is invalid. And I think regulatory agencies are more and more concerned with these aspects of quality controls in clinical trials. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian, for your talk. It was a nice and interesting presentation. A kind reminder to the audience that all questions raised so far will be taken during the Q&A after the second slideshow. Professor Diener will now take through adjudication committee organization and standardized management of endpoints. Professor Diener.
Yes, good evening. I just try to see whether I can move the slides forward. Yes, I can. Now, you heard if you want to have exact endpoints, you need to define what you mean. And the important issue is that you need a standard definition reporting the same event criteria across the world. If your trial is done in 100 countries, it always has to be the same definition. Now, this is not only important for the adjudication process, but it allows to perform pooled analysis or meta-analysis across studies and across treatments. The problem is if you have, for example, different definitions of major bleeds, it gets very difficult to perform a meta-analysis. Now, I give you a few examples. We need a good definition of what a myocardial infarction is, because if we look at the source data, we will see that the criteria for myocardial infarction will be variable. Sometimes the description of symptoms, if we look at the ECG and if we look at the laboratory parameters. And if this is not standardized and adjudicated, there is a potential for over and under-reporting of events. Now, this is also important because the standard definition has an impact on outcome, timing, and other aspects. Now, the other important issue is that we have complete reporting of events. Sometimes, for example, some events are misreported. Someone is admitted to a hospital, and then this is only reported as a serious adverse event, but not as an endpoint. For example, if someone had a myocardial infarction or if someone had a stroke. Another issue is, another example is TIAs. Some trials will not adjudicate TIAs, but we need to look at them to make sure that the TIA was not a stroke, for example. And application is able to correct misreporting. And we can also query back and try to get the missing data in order to make a proper adjudication. And what we need is basically an adjudication dossier. So we will get copies of all the documents that are available, CRF pages and source documents, and then we can start to perform our adjudication. So let me point out a few endpoints that are adjudicated in most trials. In many trials, it's vascular endpoints like myocardial infarction or acute coronary syndrome. It's stroke, both ischemic and hemorrhagic, and this can get already very tricky if a patient is admitted to a hospital which does not have a CT or MRI, and then vascular death if it's a vascular trial, for example, in cardiology or in stroke prevention or in diabetes. Other important endpoints are death of any cause, major or life-threatening bleeding, and reasons for hospitalization. Now, how do you compose an adjudication committee? The most important criterion is experience. You need people who have been in the business for many years, have a large experience both in working as a clinician but also in adjudicating cases. And for most trials where you have vascular endpoints, you need a cardiologist and neurologist. You might also need an internist, for example, if you expect adverse events at the kidney or, for example, at the liver. And if you expect anything that has to do with the bone marrow, you need a hematologist. And then other important endpoints simply depend on what you would expect in terms of adverse events, for example, from phase 2 if you go into phase 3. I give you some example. If your drug affects renal function, you need a nephrologist. If you have seen a few patients who have increase in liver enzymes, you need a hepatologist. If you expect perhaps changes in blood count, major bleeding complications, a hematologist. If there are GI bleeds or dyspepsia, a GI person. If you could expect psychiatric symptoms, you need a psychiatrist. You know that some of the drugs will cause ocular adverse events where you need an ophthalmologist, or impact on hearing or vestibular function. In this case, you need an ENT doctor. The one very tricky business is that one patient can have multiple endpoints or serious adverse events during one hospital stay. So the patient is admitted and then has complications and finally dies. And therefore, you have to adjudicate the endpoints according to severity. First, to find out what was the cause of death. Adjudication death is not difficult, but it's difficult to find whether it's vascular or non-vascular. And then the next highest priority would be for major vascular events, myocardial infarction and stroke. And then the next priority would be for major life-threatening bleeds. And then for permanent liver, renal, or bone marrow damage. And you need an adjudication committee charter needs to define how you handle multiple endpoints. Now, this is an example from an ongoing study that we are doing at the moment with Banook, and I go from the left side to the right side. A patient has a cardiovascular event. This needs to be reported within 24 hours by the investigator, and the source document will be collected, and at the same time, this information is documented in the eCRF. Within 5 working days, the monitoring team has to get source information, and if this is in a language which the adjudicators do not speak or can read, the information has to be translated. Then the Banook group will check whether the source documents are complete, whether we need translation, and then this information is transferred to us at the adjudication committee. It's internet-based. We can see not only all information from the CRF, but also from the source documents, and then we independently submit our adjudication. So, for example, for the ongoing study where Christian and myself are working, we are 3 members, and if all 3 agree, it's fine. If we disagree, we need a way how we can get to an agreement and to a final adjudication. So what we need for adjudication are hospital discharge letters and hospital reports. This is sometimes very difficult to get, in particular if a patient is admitted to a hospital which is not the hospital where the study physician is based. If this is in outside of Europe, we in many cases need translations. And then in some countries, for example in Russia, India, China, it's very difficult to get proper discharge letters from smaller hospitals. Prerequisites is that the patient signs in the informed consent procedure that he agrees that the local study coordinator can request information from hospitals or physicians or get death certificates. And we have to train our study nurses how important it is to get these documents very quickly. You know, if a patient is admitted to hospital and you try to get the discharge report 6 months later, that's a major problem usually. And we have the opportunity to ask for additional information. If we cannot make a proper adjudication based on the information we have, we can ask, for example, to get a copy of an ECG or to get a printout of laboratory values. Now, we also use the case report forms, and they should also contain trigger questions, not only spontaneous reporting. So if a patient comes for a visit, he has to be asked, were you admitted in the meantime to a hospital? Did you have an event in order to trigger this information? Now, in many studies, the adjudication is part of the electronic CRF, so all the information is in one database, and you have to create these adjudication forms at a time when you develop the CRFs, because you can only do proper adjudication if the information is in the CRF and is accessible. The best thing is to do tick boxes, and you would need free text only if the adjudication deviates from the decision of the investigator. And usually you sort the tick boxes according to expected frequency of events. This is one example from a study where vascular endpoints are collected. So it first asks, is it the primary endpoint? And the primary endpoint, for example, here is myocardial infarction, it's unstable angina, it's stroke and vascular death. And then you see the subgroups, for example, in a stroke, whether it's fatal or whether it's non-fatal, and then according to the TOAS classification. But you also need to provide information whether something that was reported by an investigator is not an endpoint. And this is something very difficult. So to make our life easy, all the documents are electronically posted. We can always access the information. When we get additional information, we can go back to the file. We will get automated notifications, and we have deadlines, and we will be reminded if the deadline is approaching. We will always see the open cases that we have to do. We will see the ongoing cases where we requested additional information, and we can look at the finalized dossiers. Sometimes we get additional information afterwards. And we have this system where the red case says there is a case for you to adjudicate, and it says you started the process, but you didn't finalize it because some information was missing. Or the green case means, no, this case is done and finished. Now, if we have consensus, and let's assume we have 3 members of the adjudication committee and they all agree, there is no additional activity required. But if there are minor deviations, then this can be resolved by email communication. But we have every 4 weeks a face-to-face telephone conference where we discuss the discordant cases and try to reach a consensus. If you set up adjudication committees the first time, they should meet in person, face-to-face, just in order to find out how well they communicate and whether it's reliable. I have other studies where it's extremely difficult to adjudicate, and there the only solution is to have a face-to-face meeting every 3 months. But this depends on the endpoints and the adverse events that need to be adjudicated. So let me summarize what are the real important issues if you adjudicate cases. Number one, it's independent, it's not subjective. You all know that investigators are subjective because they always want the best for their patients. We have standard definitions for endpoint events, which is important if you write a protocol, and these have to be the same for the adjudication committee. We can reclassify events based on the assessments that we perform. It reduces bias because caused by differences in diagnostic sensitivity and local standards of care. It also reduces the variability in data measurements, and the confidence intervals of endpoints will get smaller. I think there is now enough experience with adjudication of events and serious adverse events and adverse events, so the results are consistent, and this is clearly an improvement of data quality. And if you look at the figure, you can see the number of days for different things. Blue is, for example, if the source document are transmitted to Banuk, and then the next bar here is the one when it's assigned, and these are the days we need for adjudication. Since everything is internet-based, we can also adjudicate when we travel or when we are on vacation, and then it takes only 1 day to transmit this information to the company. So, ladies and gentlemen, this was my part, and now for the final part, I would like to hand over again to Christian, who will show you 2 cases just to explain you what we are doing. Christian?
Thank you very much, Hans-Christoph. Very clear presentation reflecting the topic and the difficulties of solving it. So here, Marion, can I have the... Yes, marvelous. Let's take an example of an adjudication dossier. So typically, we receive PDF files with a medical chart. Now, sometimes these medical charts are rather difficult to go through. They contain a lot of irrelevant information. And the best case is to have a summary letter, a letter of hospital discharge for those events that are linked to a hospital admission. We have sometimes a document that have 17 or 70 pages, but it's better to have more information than less. And from these documents, we can figure out what was the history. Some countries have different practices and do not provide very detailed information about the medical condition in the hospital. But these are the documents that we receive. They are anonymized, blinded, so there is definitely a significant amount of work to be done at Banuk Group to provide us with blinded documents. We can have radiological imaging data, ECGs, and of course biological results. Now, then the interface that Banuk has developed allows us to have the list of all events reported for a single subject. So we have their events. If there are messages addressed to us and questions, we can know that, and queries are also being followed up. So in that case, this is a complex case, a patient who had many different events, and the events that we were asked to review was the event of heart failure. The patient died afterwards, and he was hospitalized, he had a stroke, he had a previous events, and we were asked to review this event. So the first expert in the group, we are 3 in this program, the first expert said that the date of the event was correct. The date is entered by default here. The expert did validate the heart failure, considered that it was worsening of previously known heart failure, and made a comment that this was post-surgical heart failure in an infectious context, but nevertheless made that a cardiovascular event. And this comment box is not usable for data analysis, but it's extremely useful to figure out what's the reasoning behind someone's adjudication scheme. The second expert on the same case thought that the date of the event was not the 11th of January, but the 12th, and considered that this was not an event to be considered for adjudication because this was already, in his opinion, reported and adjudicated before. The third expert adjudicated the death of this patient, which actually was also in a different file. So the death was documented as cardiovascular death. So we all disagreed on that case. And we essentially disagreed because during the same course of the same hospitalization, this patient had many different medical conditions that led ultimately the patient to die. So we had a conference call, and this case was discussed with others. And the final assessments, after we all three agreed, and the chairman of the committee then enters the final adjudication, was indeed a case of heart failure, so close to expert one, the statement that this was still post-surgical heart failure, and that the patient ultimately died on February 3rd, 2015. Now, in that trial, we had defined that if someone was coming in the hospital with a condition that led to death, this would lead to a single event being reported, which would be death. If the amount of time spent between the initial hospital admission and the death was short enough. In that case, it was longer than the predefined rule, so we decided to make an event for this heart failure. Do you see how complex these cases are? Do we need to only adjudicate the death? Do we need to adjudicate heart failure? What will be the primary event taken into consideration by the statistical analysis plan? All these items need to be defined beforehand. And that's it. That's an example one. That just shows how complex the process can be and how pleasant the web interface is. Actually, Hans-Christoph and I and the other member of the committee, Emilio Vanoli from Italy, live in different countries. I think we met once or twice 3 years ago, and it seems that we know each other very well because we interact by phone and on the web. So it's a very
yes, and perhaps a final remark, the last thing you need on the adjudication committee is a member with a huge ego who wants to dominate everything. That it's not very productive. These people who work together have to work very well together, and we become friends over time.
Yes, I guess I'm the one with the big ego here.
Not really.
But that's fine. It's actually very important that the members of the committee get along well together, because I mean, we all know that we're not always right, so we need to listen to the other's arguments. And it's interesting in this program that Hans-Christoph is a neurologist in vascular diseases. The two other members are cardiologists, and sometimes Hans-Christoph makes cardiology diagnoses that we did not make, and we agree with him. And there is no hard feeling by recognizing that a neurologist can know cardiology in the context of a clinical trial better than we. So it's important to get along well, and that's the case in that program.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Diener and Christian. So at this point, I would like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions or comments and start the Q&A session of the webinar. So far, we already received quite a number of questions. We might not be able to answer all of them, so we suggest to pick up 2 for each topic, and all other will be addressed directly for as far as possible. It's planned also to consolidate all interaction in a dedicated white paper in the upcoming weeks, which will be shared on Banu Group's website. So let's get started with our first question for you, Christian. The first question was, is there a regulatory requirement for all phase 3 and 2 to have an adjudication committee?
No, as you have seen, not for all studies. There is a specific guidance for drug development in type 2 diabetes because, as you know, with the glitazones drugs, the studies have not been detecting cardiovascular events. So it's not a systematic procedure, but it's clearly the guidance indicates that any complex trial looking at data that are difficult to adjudicate is going to be much more credible if there is an adjudication committee. In the program that we're working now, Hans-Christoph and I with Banu Group, the drug that we're looking at is not a cardiovascular drug. The question is, can this non-cardiovascular drug cause cardiovascular events? The centers who follow the patients are not specialized in cardiology. The patients, as Hans-Christoph mentioned, are often hospitalized elsewhere, not in their centers. They learn that the patient had an event 1 month after the events occurred when they come to a visit at their center. So this is typically the type of complex setting where you need to have people behind who collect information. And it's up to the company to detect whether the study is complex and make sure that they will come to the regulatory agency with a trial that is so solid evidence of what they have found that there is no question that the effect they have found is real.
I can perhaps add, any company who runs a trial, in particular phase 3, wants to have it published. And you will not be successful to get a manuscript published in Lancet or the New England Journal if your endpoints were not adjudicated.
Okay, so the second question maybe to be addressed to you, Christian, again, is what is the cost of an adjudication committee?
High. It's high. Of course it's high because there is a lot of work behind this. It's high because you need to have monitors collecting the information. Investigators will ask maybe for extra money for the time allowed to this task. You need to have a CRO just like Banu Group to polish and prepare all these documents, blind them. Of course, members of adjudication committee are extremely expensive to pay. So the price is high, definitely. But if you consider the cost of a trial, especially the cost of a study that is rejected by a regulatory agency, in my opinion, the cost is worth the expense.
Thank you, Christian. Third question is for you, Professor Diener. How many members in an adjudication committee?
Yeah, number one, it always has to be an uneven number, so you can get a majority vote. And it simply depends on the endpoint and the anticipated serious adverse events. For example, for a usual trial that is done in stroke or in cardiology, it's enough if you have 3 or 5 members. If you expect major problems with serious adverse events in other areas, you might need more. I think the minimum number is 3.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question to be addressed is why can't we use a company's pharmacovigilance service to adjudicate?
Yeah, the purpose of pharmacovigilance is very different. And this, you know, what pharmacovigilance does not allow is to put events into clinical context. And we just discussed someone having multiple events in one hospital stay. You will never be able to find out what was perhaps related to the drug or not if you only would use a MEDRA system, for example, for coding. This is extremely important. You need pharmacovigilance. There is no way around it. And this information has to go to the Data Safety Monitoring Board, as well as the information that we provide from the adjudication. The big difference between the DSMB and us is we are blinded, and the DSMB is usually unblinded and can make a decision whether it's safe to continue a study or whether it has to be stopped.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dino and Professor Frank Bertano, for all your answers to the questions. We have reached the end of the Q&A portion of this webinar. If you do have any further questions, you can address them to me at the following email address, marion.dopley@banugroup.com. Thank you everyone for participating at the conference, and sorry for the technical issue we faced at the beginning. We hope the webinar was interesting to everyone. You will receive a follow-up email with access to the record archive for this event. Thank you very much. Good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.